when push comes to shove, I probably side with values rather over interests. In my conception, our interests align with our values. Actually, they're in harmony most of the time, but we're in a world a realist world in which potentially you have folks that don't necessarily think values are relevant and act on a short-term transactional interest. You can't have a functional foreign policy if you sacrifice your values to interests, and you can't have a functional foreign policy if you sacrifice your interests to values. There's a balance between the two. This is not an idealistic or ideological venture. It is a practical approach.
For this episode of Values and Interests, I'm joined by Alex Vindman, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and famously the former Director for European Affairs on the White House's National Security Council in the first Trump administration. Alex and I delve into how the U.S. might pursue a realist foreign policy without abandoning its core values. We unpack the complicated but critical interplay between morality and power in the practice of geopolitics. We explore the Trump administration's increasingly transactional approach to foreign policy, and close with a discussion on what a just end to the war in Ukraine might look like. Alex's latest book is The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. As always, be sure to subscribe to Carnegie Council on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. So Alex Vindman, thank you so much for joining us at Carnegie Council today on the Values and Interests podcast. There's obviously a lot going on in the world geopolitically right now. There are many questions in relation to both values and morals related to foreign policy, and also these kind of more realist arguments that are floating out there right now in terms of America first and Western first and kind of what that means. And so really happy you're here today as a practitioner, as somebody who has thought deeply about these values and interest questions in the practice of U.S. foreign policy. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So what we do at the Values and Interests podcast is I want to start by kind of having the audience learn a bit about your own value system, your own background. We feel very strongly at the council that a lot of times foreign policy, governments, institutions are thought of as these monolithic things, right? But they're not. They're made up of people who have their own personal value systems, which then inform the principles, which then inform the actual policies of the world or military action of the world. So I wanted to start by kind of hearing from you about your own value system, and then we can kind of go from there.
So I wrote a book about this. My first book, was a memoir, Here Right Matters, and I attempted to kind of diagnose what drove me from a values perspective. I kind of played with this idea of kind of the genetic memory of my family, and kind of the overcoming the challenges of the 20th century. Both my grandfathers were killed in World War II, fighting in the Red Army, fighting the Nazis. And then my dad and his mother and sister fled to the Ural Mountains and survived the war, survived the Jewish massacres and things of that nature. And my dad's ability to, kind of his resilience starting over many times. So I think part of my value set is this agility, flexibility, resilience to be able to start over and keep starting over, which is the kind of a line that I repeated in my first book. I think that resilience is a kind of a cornerstone. But resilience, much like realism and values, have a kind of an interplay, a resilience that is not willing to sacrifice ethics and values. So kind of a principled resilience. If we're going to come up with that term, principled resilience. So, adjusting and adapting, but without kind of devolving to nastiness. I think that immigrant experience growing up in the United States built on some of those, genetic or kind of hereditary traits. And that experience and both successes and failures along the way, and learning from mistakes, which I think I'm pretty frank in talking about the fact that I screwed up as a young guy. I got kicked out of my first university and, kind of then overcorrected and got couple of masters and a doctorate and stuff like that. So a hard work ethic is important. I think the military was critically important to instilling some discipline, but not through kind of force, but through just a responsibility. And
Mm,
um, you know, just like folks learn when they're most interested and enthusiastic, and their passions are activated. I think the military did a lot of that for me. And then the military's value set is something I talk about,
yep,
almost every conversation I have with young folks or military folks, which is for the Army, it's we use the acronym leadership: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. And I
yep,
talk about the fact that, like, when I'm really facing challenges, I really devolve down to basic decisions on what's right and what's wrong, and
yep,
how that aligns with those values. And now, being a public figure, I feel even a kind of a greater duty to make sure that I adhere to those value sets, because for at least some corners of the public, I'm put on a pedestal as a kind of a moral
mm,
actor. And
yep,
we need we need good models. And I'm not
yep,
saying that, like, I walk on water or anything, but I definitely attempt to try to model good behavior for young
yep,
folks that are seeing too much bad behavior
yep.
from leadership. So those are the things that generally drive me. And then I think about the way I conduct myself with as a foreign policy or national security actor.
Mm,
How do these things actually align? Do they work? And I think that
yep.
in many cases they do. So that's kind of the snapshot.
Good. So I want to push a little bit on this alignment between values and interests. So I spoke a few weeks back on the podcast with Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and we talked a lot about kind of this inculcation of values, as he talked about. And he mentioned this tension that he found in kind of mid 2000s in trying to think about how do I reinvent the values training within the US Army, and how do I not make it this thing that people have to do, but a thing that is valuable from a realist perspective, right? It is our job to go out there and conduct a mission, right? How do values help us to do that and not feel like it's this moral albatross around the neck? So could you talk a little about your experience in the alignment, or, in some situation, I'm sure there's tension between values and interests, but how do you kind of think about that personally?
I guess there is tension. When push comes to shove, I probably side with values rather over interests. And I
Mm,
mean, that's certainly the foreign policy school of thought that I advocate for: the centrality of values, or the primacy of values. Not that you discard interests, that would be foolhardy. There's an interplay, and there's a recognition that, maybe there's maybe sometimes even the greater good might necessitate a hue towards interests, but with the recognition that you are kind of undermining the value. So that's
yep.
all conceptual. From a practical standpoint, I would say that in the course of my career, I've been pushed to and trained to do certain things, like
Mm,
don't walk by a mistake, something that General Hertling would really kind of fully understand and embrace, and has attempted to advocate for. And you could do that up and down the leadership hierarchy.
mm,
Interesting enough, in most cases, especially with good quality leaders, if you deliver your that correction with respect and earnestness, that is
mm,
sufficient. And then, of course, there are times where that doesn't go so well, like with the first impeachment, where my efforts were actually behind the scenes to counsel the president that he's making a mistake, and that he should correct course, both for his own personal kind of interests as well as for the nation's interests. And that that was disregarded, and resulted in an abuse of power, and an impeachment. So the other aspect of that, I think, is has been important to me, is I've been encouraged to voice my opinion.
Mm.
Certainly, the more senior I became, the more I was encouraged to kind of voice my opinion. In certain regards, I had a really, you know, wonderful career with lots of kind of unique, singular experiences amounting to a singular perspective on issues.
Mm.
And I found that, I'd sometimes be looked at to provide, in far more senior kind of venues, I'd be looked at for kind of, an authoritative opinion or
Yep.
recommendation on a course of action. So I've been encouraged to not kind of, yeah, again, to be diplomatic and thoughtful and respectful, but to deliver my counsel, regardless of whether it was aligned or at odds with, the conventional thinking in
Yep.
the room. So I think that I don't know if that quite gets to your kind of tension between values and interests. I don't know if they're that misaligned or if the tension is that great. I think it's
Mm.
the perception that the
Yeah.
tension is great. In my conception, our interests align with our values. So
Yep.
they're in harmony most of the time.
Yep.
But we're in a world a realist world in which potentially you have folks that don't necessarily think values are relevant and
Yep.
act on in a short-term transactional interest. That's the
Yep.
part potentially the tension. The time
Yep.
horizon, the short-term transactional nature is what creates the tension. And
Yep.
in those kinds of situations, you might have to be adroit in kind of navigating some of those things, but always always kind of focused on the long-term interests.
I think one of the things that is concerning to us at the council right now is that, you know, from a high level values perspective, it seemed post World War II that, you know, practitioners were given this values and interest equation, right? You can't just throw one out for the other. It seems now that under the guise of this stripped down version of transactional realism, that values are either being deprioritized or thought of as something that a sucker would use if instead of like negotiating a good deal, right? So there's this transition to transactional amoral foreign policy, which feels very tactical. And you talk about this in the book a lot in terms of kind of the short-term tactical considerations within Ukraine, going all the way back to Crimea. And what does that cost us in the long term? Because maybe values didn't influence our quote unquote realist approach as much as it should have, in your opinion. So maybe it would be good to kind of pivot a bit to Ukraine and kind of the wider geopolitical conversation around this values and interests equation right now. And hopefully, I laid out your thesis partially well, and I'm happy to be corrected if not.
Sure, no. So I definitely, I think there's, Ukraine. The book was written as a case study on how realism, certainly in its most transactional form, not like the high craft, like might be associated with, let's say, Kissinger or something like that,
Yep.
because he's an exception. I
Yep.
think the rest of it has been, what I refer to as faux realism,
Yep.
and it's been, kind of transactional, short-sighted, catering to hopes and fears. But I wanted to address this idea that, somehow um, folks that think through and serve values are the suckers.
Yeah.
I think actually it's the exact opposite. I think it's if we manage to with mistakes along the way, if we manage to stick to a kind of world order and principles during a much more dangerous, for
Mm.
most of our post-World War II history, Cold War with the threat of nuclear Armageddon, and we navigated it with kind of this high-minded world order, sometimes suppressing maximum benefit for the greater good. In this, for much of the post Cold War era, we had an easier go of it. Transnational terror did not pose a existential threat. And I think it's kind of I don't even kind of understand the mentality that says that now in this time where kind of we're still singular power, that we need to devolve and shift away from the values that have allowed us to be successful to a much more transactional kind of interest-based approach. That doesn't make sense. That shows, if anything, that is kind of the mythology of deal making, realism, um, that's taken us to this direction that, maybe we left something on the table, but only in the immediate, what's immediately in front of us. Because long term, the U.S., if we're continuing that metaphor of, kind of card games, the U.S. was the house. The
Yep.
U.S. benefited from stability. The U.S. benefited from, kind of the reserve currency being the dollar, benefited from all these things. So we had to get the lion's share of the prosperity because of the short-term suppression of, kind of maximalist interests in the beginning. So it doesn't really, this idea doesn't make sense to me.
Yep.
So now when we take a look at, kind of where we started this question with the case study, that's my book, and how things went wrong with regards to Ukraine, I basically, I think, make almost an exhaustive case looking at about six different moments, all through that Russia, US, Ukraine relationship. And these were critical junctures in the relationship where we really catered to misplaced hopes and fears, catered to interests rather than sufficiently to our values. And I think, from my standpoint, um, we are continuing the mistakes of the past, just
Hmm.
like I articulate in the book. We're continuing, and Trump is just the kind of the end stage, the kind of the amplified version of the mistakes of the last several decades of making transactional decisions,
Hmm.
catering to interests and hopes and fears, instead of pivoting back to what really kind of makes us strong and
Hmm.
principled approach to the way we conduct ourselves around the world.
So, in terms of the environment right now, because as we've talked about, there does not seem to be an appetite from a large portion of the US population for a more values-based grand strategy, right? I'm painting with a broad brush here, but there seems to be a shift in terms of the appetite of the American people to an extent. It's certainly different than 1998 right now. In terms of looking at the failure to sell that vision, a liberal values-based international order vision, selling that to the American people. So one of the things I focus on here at the council is narratives within U.S. foreign policy, and we've been looking closely at kind of this defunding slash collapse of the U.S. soft power apparatus the last few months. And we've had very blunt conversations with people who worked in that space where they assumed the virtue of what they were doing and they thought that message was permeating to the American people. And so we need to actually message outward and make the case outward, right? But now they're in a situation where the institutions that they worked for are gone, right? And that has to do a lot with a failure to make a case effectively to domestic America. And so I was wondering, thoughts on that parallel to US foreign policy, disagreements with that parallel. It's something I'm very interested in right now.
It's interesting. I would say that just like I criticize faux realism, I also criticize faux idealism, which is basically and that's why there's a different kind of view with, this, like I said, an imperfect label to for this idea of neo-idealism,
Yep.
fundamentally a kind of a view that values are central to our interests, and
Yep.
we should act from a position of values primacy. And the reason is that the realists and neocons got us into a couple decades of war,
Mm.
and the idealists didn't navigate our challenges really all that much better. I mean, a lot of some kind of high-minded, rhetoric, but in terms of practice, not really much delivered. I mean, there were some pretty important things. Like I'd say from a domestic standpoint, the fact that, President Obama delivered the Affordable Care Act and that a
Yep.
lot of folks rely on it, and now it's a wildly popular program. I think that's, an example of the fact that delivering on those values. But
Yep.
they were kind of few and far in between. And I think we missed some opportunities along the way to make the case as to why idealism should be the way we govern ourselves. And I think I also struggle with this idea of like, is Donald Trump a product of the environment, or is he one of those historical figures, which there are plenty of those, that have, enormous agency and also define and drive the environment? And I
Yep.
think it's a combination of both.
Yep.
I think it's a combination of the fact that, lots of folks were left behind because idealism, delivered some, but not everything that,
Yep.
or insufficiently to the population. Too many people were left behind, and a lot of folks were acting out of grievance. And then the enormous agency that, he has almost as a cult-like figure
Yep.
and drives this acute turn to, transactional deal making that hasn't really served us all that well in the past, and is going to, we're going to see it live here over the course of the next, several years, but
Yep.
how tariffs are going to play out on our economy and a bunch of other different kinds of factors, cuts
Yep.
in social safety nets, a president that is happy and eager to um, engage in loose talk around nuclear weapons.
Mm.
A president, when I'm used to presidents that when they say something, it actually means something,
Yep.
not one that, it's kind of like a bunch of hot air. So we're
Yep.
we're going to see the results of this kind of deal making, kind of ultimate realism, and I don't think it's going to serve us very well.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges in being in the think tank world or the academic world is kind of breaking free of old frameworks of thinking when you're analyzing policy. So again, from the narratives perspective, right? If you go back and look, there used to be not an inch of space between when a president stepped to the podium and their policy. Now there couldn't be a larger gulf between those two things. And there's different dynamics in terms of who is kind of quote unquote, washing the message for different audiences to be more digestible. But yeah, no, it's a very challenging moment in terms of like what do the people in power actually mean? This goes back to kind of what you talked about before, the importance of moral leadership. One of the things we've been looking at the council is this from an ethics perspective in terms of what we do is uh, you talked about Trump. Is he a symptom or is he something that is driving the institutional change? And I'm not speaking for the council, but my own opinion is to a point, I think there was a permission structure, right, that allowed it to happen. And then you get actually the system becoming what he now wants it to be, right? So there were many times where moral leadership could have stepped up as a red line, but that just never happened. And then kind of institutionally, normatively, you start to see this death by a thousand cuts. So that's my high level from an applied ethics perspective, but obviously there's much more work to do to analyze that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to an earlier point you made about the tension between interests and values, and General Hertling's commentary. I mean, this issue is particularly close to home for me. Um, I'm I'm in a different chapter of my life out of the military
Yep.
because I think the military as a whole made a calculation about the greater good, in part to preserve the institution, and in part probably individuals for their own personal benefit decided that this was not a fight that they wanted to get
Yep.
into. They needed to be there to be in the breach for more dangerous moments.
Yep.
Instead, what they did was they sacrificed and kind of present themselves as potential, vulnerable prey to predators like Donald Trump, and invited that kind of behavior to. So I think that for me, I've been consistent. I've tried to be consistent, kind of, and in holding to principles and values, even if we are in an environment in which the chief executive has no floor to his behavior, models kind of abhorrent behavior. Frankly, in a lot of ways, is about one of the weakest men we've had in public leadership. Just kind of really thin-skinned, and not modeling, let's say, the Marvel Man that
Hmm.
was supposed to be the iconic kind of American male archetype or something of that nature.
Yep.
And I think that we're in a moment in which it's acceptable to some. It's acceptable to say, well, that's just politics. That's
Yep.
that's the way. That's what we should expect. And in a completely different sphere. I think that we should hold our elected officials to a higher standard, not a lower standard, and that I'm not willing to compromise in that regard. And maybe American society might come around to this idea because of the costs that we're going to see unfold during this administration. I think, we're early days, but we're seeing some of these indicators already with regards to a kind of weakness in the economy. Um, that's just going to amplify.
Yep. No, it's been interesting, again, in terms of kind of the conflation of concepts, at least in the first few months, where you see this kind of this group of writers and practitioners in government, saying that, America first now, transactional foreign policy is pure realism manifest, right? And so at the council, we've always been very wary of that. If I was going to distill down to the one thing we do, it's making sure that people within foreign policy are asking the question, power, but to what end? And that goes back to Hans Morgenthau and Reinhold Niebuhr and this concept of Christian realism. I have to send you this. There's this great academic article from the 50s where it's just a collection of letters back and forth between Morgenthau and Niebuhr, kind of debating this values and interests equation. Now that the U.S. is has assumed the supreme mantle of the international system, but you know what Niebuhr really talks about is this fact that you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Like states must be cognizant of kind of this pure evil that might be out there in the world, but we have to weigh moral values alongside national interests to avoid the other end of the spectrum, which is basically liberal idealist overreach. And we've seen the consequences of both of those in the past 80 years. And you know,
Yeah.
um, the the Morgenthau Niebuhr back and forth in this particular article has been quite formative for me at the council. I just wanted to mention that.
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's been a few years. There was an assistant secretary, Wes Mitchell,
Yep.
who's quite capable, but is on the center right, I'd say. I don't think.
Yep.
And I remember having an interesting conversation with him, and the fundamental kind of takeaway was you can't have a functional foreign policy if you sacrifice your values to interests, and you can't have a functional foreign policy if you sacrifice your interests to values. There's a balance between the two, and in my balance, the scales tip towards values as a kind of
Yep.
mainly as a pragmatic and practical approach. This is not an idealistic or ideological
Yep.
venture. It is a practical approach because we know that the way we practice realism doesn't really work. It's short term, it's transactional. And if we
Yep.
hew towards values primacy, then that focuses us on our long term views
Yep.
and not what's immediately in front of us. And that's what could keep us kind of kind of navigating. I'm actually finishing up like in there's a the three body problem, this kind of the science
Yeah.
fiction book.
Yeah.
The third I'm in the third book and kind of the last section, and there's this kind of dark forest. It is a really kind of interesting um realist view of the universe in which you basically have this the fundamental idea is that dark forest and any kind of sentient life form is going to snuff out any other sentient life form because of the
Mm.
threat uh,
Yep.
that could arise. So, I mean, that do we want an existence like that, or do we want to see if there's a way to build kind of we certainly within our globe, uh, small neighborhood technological explosions, asymmetries that, kind of close the gaps between powers and kind of middle powers and stuff like that. I think we need to figure out a better way than just maximally driving towards, singular national interests as defined by like who happens to be at the head of state at the moment. We need to figure out, if there's, and I'm not, again, not super wishful thinking. There are ways that we could work towards a common good where folks benefit, where it just might not be to maximum interest of one state.
Yeah, and I think that going back to kind of symptom versus cause, one of the things that's very concerning from my perspective is this kind of rejection of the pluralism sandbox domestically in the US. And I think that people before wanted to always play in that sandbox. There was a big political spectrum to an extent. And now I think there are liberal actors looking for the right moment to kind of destroy the sandbox,
I
right?
don't know if that's true, actually, Kevin. I think
Interesting.
I think it's true on the macro level, on the
Yeah.
national level. It's absolutely not true on a community level. I think
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah, yeah, no, I
so,
agree with that.
so
City
it's
councils are still where people can smile at each other and get stuff done.
city councils, towns, cities. I think that the problem is somehow we are able to separate what's going on in our community and the fact that we want
Yeah,
for everybody to be we want our neighbors to do well, right? We want
yeah,
their houses not to deteriorate, and like their kids that play with our kids, we want all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
um but for whatever reason that we can't seem to amplify that to the national level.
yeah,
There it's a battle between urban or coastal and kind of midwestern, urban, suburban. And I think we lost the fact we somehow along the way we lost our kind of commonality, that we're all
yeah,
Americans. We're all working towards kind of this American project,
yeah,
we're polarized. So maybe that's the art, is figuring out how we bridge from
yeah, yeah.
the community to kind of state and national.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think my point was more the levers of power, and there are what we think about at the council, good faith and bad faith actors, and it seems like from my perspective, there's a multiplication of bad faith actors outside of this pluralistic, as I said before, sandbox, whether that's from the tech industry, whether that's politically, whether that's, fill in the blank. And so, yeah, how do we get back to kind of first principles pluralistic America that surfaces, in at the highest levels? And to my original point, I think you will, as that reflection becomes anti-pluralistic, you get a reflection of that at the foreign policy level, right, in terms of what people are wanting to push forward. So I just thinking about kind of that connection there, naturally, if you have a more liberal, and I don't mean liberal politically, I mean liberal from a values perspective, liberal government, you're going to have a better appetite for this system of cooperation that we have attempted to push forward in the past decades.
Yeah. I think one of the ways to close the gap is potentially accountability. And that's accountability in the electoral sphere, that's accountability in in courts and things of that nature. Um, I think that in the international sphere, um, I see our allies figuring out how to navigate the next 3.5 years.
Mm,
And instead of kind of an accountability approach, it's placating and pandering and catering that will only invite additional kind of predatory behavior.
mm,
And maybe that's the way you navigate just the next 3.5 years. But certainly
yeah,
that doesn't help with the accountability mechanism
yeah,
where you could potentially, because Trump is not a strong guy. He's not a strong man. I think where he sees weakness and vulnerability, he exploits it.
mm,
His worldview in a lot of ways is not all that dissimilar to Putin's. Small and medium states are you can predate, and
yeah,
larger states you have to kind of glad hand and kind of
yeah,
talk with or pander to. Um, Putin's worldview is, there are three powers: Russia, China, and the
yeah,
U.S. I think Trump agrees with that general idea, and that like those are the ones those are the tough deals. Everybody else you put the squeeze
yeah,
on.
yeah, yeah,
So I think that there are other the EU should be a tough deal. The
yeah,
EU it can be a formidable um, way to institute some accountability. And I think the calculations are totally understandable. Is it worth taking frankly a substantial economic hit um, in an environment where you have a kind of a far right that's looming, and economic weakness could kind of drive that and result in similar hostile takeover of the values in Europe. So I kind of could understand it, but I know it doesn't help us get to accountability and correction.
Yep. So I want to pull back to kind of this 30,000 foot level, and you talk about it a bit in the book through the lens of Ukraine, but just in terms of, you mentioned this before, you kind of have this future where US foreign policy is driven by transactional diplomacy, deal making, and we kind of take our sphere of influence and we let Russia have theirs and we let China have theirs and kind of retreat into our quote unquote realist nationalist bubbles. If you could talk a little bit about kind of that pathway, and then another pathway would be kind of a revitalization, or maybe not a revitalization, or reimagining in some way, right? To think about this liberal international order. What does that look like moving forward? And I'm not asking you to use a crystal ball here in terms of what it's going to be, but like, if you were talking to policymakers, right, how would you be framing that?
I mean, I think I do have a better of a crystal ball.
Okay, great.
Uh, I So look, I think in this dark scenario that has a reasonable chance of unfolding. We're talking about many more nuclear states, so kind of the existential threat is amplified. We're talking about great power competitors that amplify and maximize their strength. So, China seizes Taiwan, builds out kind of a privileged sphere, and Taiwan is just a way to kind of, and it's a way to project. It certainly has access to kind of interesting new means with regards to technology, but it's also solidifies its claim to the South China and East China Seas, kind of on let's say um, principal influence over Asia Pacific. I think there's a potential for confrontation between China and India in that kind of scenario. So a
Mm,
lot of regional instability will be a part of the theme. Russia continues with its empire building project, whether de facto or de jure. So, by occupying or kind of just putting in friendly regimes, is in a position to exert its kind of singular influence over its neighborhood, and then doesn't just end there, but potentially looks to exploit fractures with regards to NATO and the EU. So what in this kind of world, the US is isolated. It builds it consolidates its kind of strength in the Western Hemisphere. We've not been very good at it, but somehow, let's say miraculously, we build north south kind of lines, and have a really strong relationships with between the Americas or something of that nature. But in the meantime, we lose. What do we lose? We lose our biggest trading partners in Europe. We lose access to kind of or we lose our relationship with the leading democracies of the world,
mm,
and while authoritarian regimes surge, we have a much more chaos and instability that, even if we retrench, may necessitate our involvement in places like the Middle East, like we find ourselves dragged back to periodically, because we're still reliant on fossil fuels, even now, when we export at this point based on our mass
yep.
kind of the energy revolutions and so forth. So it's a much, much more difficult and challenging world for the next generation. I think that we are headed potentially, it depends on how much damage the Trump administration does, but what I see here is that there's likely to be a backlash against this transactional kind of um, base, valueless approach from the Trump administration. That is probably that door is going to open up by abuses of American population, by economic hardships, and there'll be kind of a rejection there's an opportunity to reject this kind of approach if we have the right leaders step up, articulate a vision, and that backlash, and build an American society that, delivers more services to more people that were left behind, and certainly takes advantage and rebuilds relationships. Biden, kind of demonstrated this pretty effectively in 2020, in midst of some crises, rebuilt the diplomatic relationships that had suffered under the Trump administration. I think the opportunities are going to be there. Our allies are going to look to embrace us, maybe a little more skeptically, maybe with some more hesitancy and some more hedging. But I think
Mm,
there's an opportunity to rebuild those types of relationships also. So there is out of this Trump administration, I think there's huge risks, enormous risks, but also
yep.
enormous opportunities.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think there is still an opportunity for significant swing back. We talked about kind of the values of the U.S. population domestically, and I tend to agree that we are not at the precipice yet where a swing back cannot happen, and so it'll be interesting to kind of watch that closely.
I don't think we're going to get there. I think there's going to
Okay.
be huge issues. I think there's going to be, an attempt to use force against the civilian population. I think that's the
Yeah.
whole idea of exploding the ICE budget. I think there's going to be mucking around with regards to elections in certain regards, kind of
Yep.
gerrymandering districts. But what I think there's also on the horizon is a potential explosion of people power
Yeah.
that is kind of irresistible.
Yeah.
And that's something that um, if I'm wrong, it's because the American people just kind of stay timid and silent
Yeah.
as their rights get stripped away. But we tend
Yeah.
to kind of be a feisty, fiery lot. Lots of fights if you look at the history of the United States. And I don't. When push comes to shove, uh, we'll shove back. And I think that's what ultimately kind of it doesn't have to necessarily be violent. It just be mass protests or kind of people showing up in elections in unprecedented numbers. There's some
Yep.
evidence of that happening. So
Yep.
I guess that's, I'm a glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah. No, good. Good to hear. There's definitely, again, going back to something we think about a lot at the council is kind of what does moral resilience look like from both an individual level, but then also from a political level, from a business level, right? Like what role can you play in an open society? And that toolkit has certainly not been taken away. It just, I had an interview last week with a moral philosopher, and we kind of talked about the defeating nihilism in this moment and what that means in terms of kind of these bigger existential questions in international relations, but also just the feeling of that politically in the US and other countries. So it certainly is on our mind at the council, and we'll be watching that closely. So I wanted to close with going back to the current situation in Ukraine specifically. And so for me, it just feels like there's been this roller coaster of a US Ukrainian relationship the first few months of Trump 2.0. We have the low point of the Oval Office meeting or Bridge Colby kind of pulling arms shipments in the middle of the night. And then, you have Trump probably for based on anger towards Putin versus love for Zelensky, sending nuclear submarines to the region, right? And kind of saying there's a deadline, etc. So I wanted to get a sense of it's so hard to read this situation from an outsider's perspective. How are you reading the current situation geopolitically and the relationship between the US and Ukraine? And then to really close the interview, I wanted to get your thoughts on what we think about here at the council as kind of justice, right? So what does a just peace look like for you in Ukraine in terms of ending the
Gotcha.
conflict?
So, it's interesting. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs. I want to say it was in January, that would look at the arc of kind of Trump and Ukraine. And one of the things I was most concerned about was just completely cutting Ukraine off in the initial stages to cater to Putin and his animus for Ukraine, and his disregard for smaller states. And we actually, because of deft diplomacy by our allies,
Hmm.
with regular visits and Zelensky, in spite of that Oval Office, I think that actually was an important moment because you know I think it probably garnered some respect from Trump, kind of in
Hmm.
hindsight. And he's not a particularly reflective guy, but he doesn't like folks that are weak. He likes kind of tougher guys. And
Mm.
Zelensky's not wasn't a pushover. He couldn't be because he's leading his country in a war. So I actually wrote that I think it would be a 6 month time horizon before Trump kind of reforms. I mean,
Mm.
hard learning, mainly recognizing that it's not the Ukrainians that are the impediment to his biggest this desire for peace, and his kind of his the way he wants to present himself as the peacemaker and Nobel candidate and stuff like that. It's not the Europeans that are not pulling their share.
Yeah.
They're kicking in five, they're pledging to kick in 5%. Ukraine's willing to bend over backwards. It's Putin.
Yeah.
It's Putin that keeps pulling the rug out from under him. I wrote and repeatedly said that it would be I could see 6 months down the road, and we're there now, that he would ultimately kind of pivot to this more hard-nosed approach in
Mm.
which he potentially returns to at least a status quo ante, meaning like, there won't be a further presidential drawdowns, but there will be, sales of weapons.
Yeah.
That was another question. I thought he was going to do it, and he's going to do it. He's going to sell
Mm.
weapons to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. So all that's actually, what I'm kind of struck by how much of this was actually quite predictable,
Yeah.
not unpredictable, but quite
Mm.
predictable. In
Yeah.
that, if you look at the fact that Putin was going to be unyielding and look to
Yeah.
exploit and kind of nudge the Trump's kind of fractious approach anyway, that the Ukrainians were going to act on their urgencies to try to keep the U.S. involved, the Europeans the same
Mm.
way, and that Trump self-serving. This is all relatively predictable, actually.
Mm.
With some questions, but and you could that piece kind of made this case pretty holistically. So I think that you can, in the motivations of individuals and states, under gain an understanding of how things are going to go.
Mm.
I was relatively confident that the U.S. was going to strike at Iran, and that
Mm.
Israel was going to get its way, dragging us into their war, particularly because they were effective and it provided a moment of weakness and unique opportunity for the U.S. to deal with
Mm.
low cost. So I
Mm.
think having, I don't want to overstate this, but there are good people out there that can look at what's going on without even the exquisite intelligence and largely kind of make out the outlines of how things are going to go.
Mm.
It's not, it's not completely opaque, kind of dark black hole type of situation.
Yeah.
I don't know if that you could do that as well over long time horizons. I think you could do kind of the way I
Yeah.
laid out the case, medium, like kind of low, high probabilities and different time horizons is the
Yeah.
way to talk about it. That's kind of an analyst's trade path.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, with regards to Ukraine, I would just say that a just peace is one that ends this war sooner rather than later, that gets us as close to status quo ante February 2022, where Russia has little to nothing to show for its full-scale war, but
Mm.
can still claim and retain control of kind of de facto control over Crimea and the Donbass, that they've been occupying for more than 10 years, and that it's a full peace deferred that will take years, a change in regime in Russia to kind of delineate the
Mm.
territories and look like something closer to 1991. So I think it's going to be one in which Russia retains some territory, most notably Crimea, and then Donbass, portions of the Donbass, and the Ukrainians are willing to accept that kind of outcome, to end the war, and then let
Mm.
negotiations and time kind of deal with the situation.
Great. No, I think you've made the neo-idealist case there at the end for what a just peace looks like. So I really appreciate you laying out the vision there and really all the insights you shared with the values interest audience today. I really appreciate you joining us.